the Sundance Film Festival in Park City, Utah, this is Democracy Now!
What Trump and Netanyahu have put forward is not a peace plan, and it does not involve a Palestinian state by any possible interpretation of that term. It's essentially a diktat composed by the Israelis, dictated to young Jared Kushner, and telling the Palestinians, you must accept these humiliating terms that essentially deprive you of every single one of your national rights.
President Trump unveils his Middle East plan, standing with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House. This just after Netanyahu was indicted for corruption in Israel. He says Israel will now move towards annexing 30% of the occupied West Bank. We'll speak to Columbia University professor Rashid Khalidi, author of the new book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, as well as Mehdi Hassan of Al Jazeera. Then to the impeachment trial of President Trump.
The trial of the leader of the free world and the duly elected president of the United States. It is not a game of leaks and unsourced manuscripts. That's politics, unfortunately, and Hamilton put impeachment in the hands of this body, the Senate, precisely and specifically to be above that fray.
And then we go to South Dakota, where the state legislature is debating a bill targeting transgender youth.
Now we have lawmakers disregarding science, disregarding the urgent needs of the trans community, and saying, we do not care that you might die. We are going to make your health care and indeed your life a crime.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Capitol Hill, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell told fellow Republican senators in a private meeting he does not yet have enough votes to block Democrats from calling impeachment witnesses. Democrats are pushing for former National Security Advisor John Bolton to testify. Bolton writes in a forthcoming book that Trump personally told him he wanted to maintain a freeze on $391 million in military aid to Ukraine until Ukraine turned over materials related to former Vice President Joe Biden, his political rival. On Tuesday, Trump's defense lawyer, Jay Sekulow, tried to dismiss the reports about Bolton's book as inadmissible.
Responding to an unpublished manuscript that maybe some reporters have an idea of maybe what it says. That's what the evidence, if you want to call that evidence, I don't know what you'd call that. I'd call it inadmissible, but that's what it is.
President Trump has rejected Bolton's account, but on Monday, Trump's own former chief of staff, General John Kelly, said, quote, John Bolton says in the book, I believe John Bolton, unquote. We'll have more on Trump's impeachment later in the broadcast. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is moving towards annexing 30% of the occupied West Bank after Israel was given the green light to do so by the United States. On Tuesday, President Trump, with Netanyahu at his side at the White House, unveiled a so-called Middle East peace plan drafted by Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, without any input from Palestinians. Under the plan, Israel would gain sovereignty over large areas of the occupied West Bank. Jerusalem would be under total Israeli control, and all Jewish settlers in the occupied territory would be allowed to remain in their homes. Palestinians protested in the West Bank and Gaza against the plan. This is Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas.
I say to the partners, Trump and Netanyahu, Jerusalem is not for sale. All our rights are not for sale and are not for bargain. And your deal, the conspiracy, will not pass.
Only hours before the plan was announced, Netanyahu was indicted for corruption, marking the first time in Israel's history a sitting prime minister will face criminal charges. We'll have more on Trump's so-called Middle East peace plan after headlines. During a news conference about the Middle East plan, President Trump praised Secretary of State Mike Pompeo for shouting and cursing at NPR reporter Mary Louise Kelly after an interview on NPR on Friday.
That's impressive. That was very impressive, Mike. That reporter couldn't have done too good a job on you yesterday, right? I think you did a good job on her, actually. That's good.
In a New York Times op-ed, Kelly writes about how Pompeo swore at her, called her a liar, and challenged her to find Ukraine on a map after she questioned Pompeo first about U.S. diplomacy with Iran and then about the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. Kelly's NPR colleague, Michelle Kellerman, has now been denied credentials to travel with Pompeo on his visit to Ukraine, which begins tomorrow. And more news on the media, the Washington Post has reinstated reporter Felicia Sonmez after she was suspended for tweeting a link to an article about the 2003 rape case against Kobe Bryant in the wake of his death in a helicopter crash. The Washington Post, Guild, and other journalists came out in support of Sonmez, who's faced a slew of rape and death threats for tweeting the article. Meanwhile, new details have emerged about the crash, which also killed Kobe Bryant's 13-year-old daughter, Gianna, and 7 others on Sunday. The helicopter did not have a terrain awareness and warning system, although the National Transportation Safety Board has long urged federal regulators to require the system be installed on all helicopters. Tributes for the basketball star Kobe Bryant continue to pour in from across the world, and the NBA postponed last night's scheduled game between the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Clippers. Instead, a major tribute took place. The spreading coronavirus has now killed 132 people in China, with nearly 6,000 more patients infected worldwide. China's locked down more than a dozen cities, essentially quarantining over 50 million people. Hundreds of Americans have been evacuated from Wuhan, the epicenter of the virus, but some of their family members without U.S. visas have been left behind, or families refuse to leave the members of their family that aren't U.S. citizens. British Airways has suspended all flights in and out of China. In Syria, over 100,000 civilians have been displaced from the northwestern province of Idlib in the last week as the Russian-backed Syrian government continues its bombing and ground offensive against the rebel-controlled territory. The Syrian regime announced today it seized control of the key town of Marat al-Numan, which former residents say is now largely destroyed. In Madagascar, at least 30 people have been killed and 16,000 more have been displaced by massive floods triggered by torrential downpours. Increased rainfall and flooding is fueled by climate change. And Mississippi is moving to shut down a unit at the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman after 9 prisoners have died in the prison within the last month. At least 3 men have been found hanging in their cells in the last week. Prisoners have filed a lawsuit arguing the conditions at Parchman are unconstitutional. And in Maryland, a Prince George's County police officer has been charged with murder after he fired 7 shots at an African-American man whose hands were cuffed behind his back and who was sitting in the front passenger seat of the police car. Officer Michael Owen, who is also black, killed 43-year-old William Green on Monday, shooting at him at point-blank range after taking him into custody for an alleged traffic accident. Officer Owen also shot and killed a man in 2011. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Park City, Utah. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has announced plans to move ahead with annexing about 30% of the occupied West Bank after Israel was given the green light to do so by the United States. On Tuesday, President Trump stood by Netanyahu to unveil the Middle East plan that was drafted by Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, without any input from Palestinian leaders. The plan was introduced just hours after Netanyahu was indicted for corruption and in the middle of Trump's impeachment trial in the Senate. Under the plan, Israel will gain sovereignty over large areas of the occupied West Bank. Jerusalem would be under total Israeli control, and all Jewish settlers in the occupied territory would be allowed to remain in their homes. The plan also calls for a 4-year settlement freeze and the possible creation of a truncated Palestinian state, but only if a number of conditions are met. This is President Trump.
My vision presents a win-win opportunity for both sides, a realistic two-state solution that resolves the risk of Palestinian statehood to Israel's security. Today, Israel has taken a giant step toward peace. Yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu informed me that he is willing to endorse the vision as the basis for direct negotiations. And I will say the general also endorsed, and very strongly, with the Palestinians, a historic breakthrough.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu praised the U.S. deal.
For too long, far too long, the very heart of the land of Israel, where our patriarchs prayed, our prophets preached, and our kings ruled, has been outrageously branded as illegally occupied territory. Well, today, Mr. President, you are puncturing this big lie. You are recognizing Israel's sovereignty over all the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, large and small alike.
Palestinians responded to the U.S. plan with protests in the West Bank and Gaza. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas rejected the deal.
I say to the partners, Trump and Netanyahu, Jerusalem is not for sale. All our rights are not for sale and are not for bargain. And your deal, the conspiracy, will not pass.
For more, we're joined in New York by Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University, the author of several books. His latest is just out. It's called The 100 Years' War on Palestine. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Professor Khalidi. Can you start off by responding to this plan? The scene yesterday at the White House, President Trump, in the midst of the Senate impeachment trial nearby in the Capitol, standing next to the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who had just been indicted yesterday for corruption.
Right. Well, what these two miscreants have done, one of them impeached and the other indicted, is to roll out an Israeli peace plan. A peace plan that was dictated to young Jared Kushner by his Israeli mentors, and who have fulfilled the wish list of the extreme Israeli right ever since they conquered the West Bank in 1967, and I would even say going back even further. This is meant to end the Palestine question. This is meant to expand Greater Israel from the river to the sea. There's no state in this for the Palestinians. Sovereignty will reside solely in Israel. Control will reside solely in Israel. And in fact, what it means is not just annexation and so on and so forth. It means that the United States and Israel are going to dictate the terms or try to dictate the terms of a settlement. We will never see this thing come to pass. It is so unrealistic. It is so at odds with not only international law, but everything everybody has put forth, except the extreme Israeli right and their friends in Washington, since the beginning of this conflict. It is, in my view, yet another declaration of war on the Palestinians in this 100 years war that's been going on since the beginning of the 20th century.
So Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas called Trump's plan a conspiracy. And the Prime Minister, Mohammed Shtayyeh, said in advance of its release, it's nothing but a plan to liquidate the Palestinian issue. If you can say more how this plan came into being, I want to turn, though, first to the voices of some Palestinians who took to the streets on Tuesday to protest the U.S. deal.
Regarding the plan of the century, we say to Trump and the American administration that our people are united behind our Palestinian leadership, represented by President Abbas. We reject this plan, the plan of shame that has nothing to offer Palestinians.
I think that this speech came to support Benjamin Netanyahu to help him to pass his internal crisis. It is also part of the election campaign for Donald Trump in the coming election. It is nothing more than an election campaign for both.
This plan is a gift from a big thief to a small thief.
Professor Khalidi, those are voices of Palestinians from Gaza to Hebron. So what exactly does it mean when the U.S. stands with Israel at the White House and puts this forward, developed by the young developer, Jared Kushner?
Yeah, well, I don't think Jared Kushner has an idea in his head about anything to do with Palestine or Israel. He knows what he's told. And this is dictated to him by his Israeli mentors. And it is meant to be an Israeli diktat to the Palestinians, telling them, you will not have Jerusalem, you will not have sovereignty, you will not have any of your national rights, and you will get what we choose to give you when we choose to give it to you. And the United States has now endorsed that position. In so doing, the United States actually separates itself from every country in the world except a few client states in the Arab Gulf. It puts itself in a position completely at odds, not only with past American positions, but every aspect of international law. We heard Netanyahu call the description of the occupied territories as illegally occupied. We heard him call that a lie. The liar here is Netanyahu. International law is not determined by an indicted president, an impeached president, and an indicted Israeli prime minister. It's determined by others, and others have long since determined that those territories are illegally occupied. That what Israel does in Jerusalem, everything it does in Jerusalem, is illegal. And so this is I wouldn't call it a conspiracy. This is something cooked up by two political leaders trying to escape the plight that they're both in order to increase their chances at the next election. There's one in Israel in a little more than a month and a bit, and there's one in our country in November. And both of them think that this will help them in that regard. It won't see the light of day, but the things that it includes, such as annexation and so forth, will go ahead, and we're going to go ahead in any case. So I don't think this is a momentous a plan in any way, shape, or form. It simply represents, as I said, the wish list of the extreme Israeli right, which has now been endorsed by the American president. It has actually no valence beyond that.
This is President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, speaking on CNN.
I come from a real estate background. It was very, very difficult to draw these lines and to get a map where you can have contiguity to a Palestinian state. And again, this isn't because of something that we developed. This is something that we inherited, the situation where Israel continues to grow and grow. And what the president secured today was Israel agreeing to stop for 4 years more settlements to give the Palestinians their last chance to finally have a state.
Professor Khalidi, your response, and then put it in the context of history.
I mean, one actually has to look at this ludicrous plan, the 181 pages, and look at the map and see that either Jared Kushner is blind or he's a liar. There's no contiguity for the so-called Palestinian state. There are 5 or 6 chunks separated by swaths of Israeli territory, which is part of a plan that goes back to almost the beginning of the occupation, to chop up the West Bank so there can be no Palestinian state, so there can be no contiguity. If he can't see that, or is lying to the people on CNN, that's his problem. We should not be taken in. I suggest everybody have a quick look at that plan, because what is clear is that this is something that, I mean, you can talk about it in terms of Bantustans, you can talk about it in terms of any other kind of humiliating imposition on the rights of the indigenous population by a settler colonial regime, which is what we are seeing here. And Mr. Kushner is aiding and abetting this in his ignorance and in his passion for the extreme Israeli rights positions.
So your book, which talks about the 100 Years' War on Palestine, this is yet just another moment in history.
Right.
Put this into context of that century.
Well, and one of the things that I point out is that this is not a war waged just by Israel or by the Zionist movement on the Palestinians. This is a war that was aided, abetted, endorsed, and made possible at every stage by the greatest power of the age, whether that was Great Britain at one stage or the United States and the Soviet Union in 1947, or today, President Trump. Israel could not do this without external support. The Zionist movement could not have established itself as it did without Great Britain. And so, as you suggest, this is yet another stage in a very long process whereby not just Israel and the Zionist movement, but a whole range of collaborators or people in collusion with Israel have enabled Israel to do what it has managed to do. And it is a war on Palestine. This is not a struggle between two equals. This is not simply a struggle between two national movements. There are two peoples involved, but one of them has enormous support from the outside, and the other, the Palestinians, are an indigenous people faced with this Moloch-like colonial settler movement, which is grinding up their country, taking as much of it as it can, and only able to do this because of support from great powers like the United States under President Trump.
I want to break, and we're going to continue with Professor Rashid Khalidi, Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. His new book is just out, The 100 Years War in Palestine. And Mehdi Hassan will also join us of Al Jazeera and The Intercept. We'll continue to talk about what President Trump calls the Middle East peace plan, but Palestinians call everything from a conspiracy to simply reject this plan about what will happen in the Middle East. Then we'll talk about the impeachment trial with Mehdi Hassan that's going on now in the Senate. And finally, what's happening in South Dakota targeting trans youth. Stay with us.
صغير بعالم كبير تايه مش عارف ايش بيصير يا دوب فتحت عينك دمعت يا دوب فتحت قلبك توجعت يا دوب انضميت إلنا شفنا مفرقين يهود مسيحية مسلمين ولا واحد بده يتفهم غيره كل فكر انه احسن من غيره بس هو يستاهل الجنة وحاليا كلنا معيشين بعضنا بجهنم اما انت غير عنا قلبك نظيف من جوا ترضاش للي برا يوسخولك اياه طالب الحياة كلها مساواة اذا حد قالك اكره قول له لا انا ما بكره حد اطفالي اليوم بدنا نغير الغد.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Democratic presidential candidates Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren responded to President Trump's so-called Middle East peace plan. Sanders issued a statement saying, quote, any acceptable peace deal must be consistent with international law and multiple UN Security Council resolutions. It must end the Israeli occupation that began in 1967 and enable Palestinian self-determination in an independent, democratic, economically viable state of their own alongside a secure and democratic state of Israel. Trump's so-called peace deal doesn't come close and will only perpetuate the conflict and undermine the security interests of Americans, Israelis, and Palestinians. It's unacceptable, Sanders tweeted. Elizabeth Warren tweeted, Trump's, in quotes, peace plan is a rubber stamp for annexation and offers no chance for a real Palestinian state. Releasing a plan without negotiating with Palestinians isn't diplomacy, it's a sham. I'll oppose unilateral annexation in any form and reverse any policy that supports it, Senator Warren said. Well, we go now to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Mehdi Hassan, senior columnist at The Intercept and host of the Deconstructed podcast. He's also host of Upfront at Al Jazeera English. And still with us in New York, Professor Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University, his new book, The 100 Years War on Palestine. Mehdi Hassan, if you can respond to the presidential candidates, responding to the Middle East plan, and then how the media has covered it.
I'm glad that some of the presidential candidates, Amy, have come out strongly. Elizabeth Warren came out very quick. Bernie Sanders referring to it as annexation. Obviously, I would like them to go further, but I know the limits of U.S. political discourse when it comes to Israel-Palestine. It's good, at least, that in this election cycle you have two candidates, Warren and Sanders, talking very explicitly about Netanyahu's racism, about annexation, about this peace plan, quote-unquote peace plan being a sham. In fact, I think anyone who describes this as a quote-unquote peace plan, and there you go, I just fell into the trap because we keep hearing this phrase all the time, it's malpractice. This is not a peace plan. When you hear any political candidate for office, any journalist referring to it as a peace plan, you really need to stop and think twice about that, because this is a plan for apartheid. This is a plan for settler colonialism, as Professor Khalidi mentioned earlier before the break. And I think we need to be clear about our terms. And of course, you know, the New York Times put out a tweet yesterday when the plan came out, a breaking news tweet where they talked about the Palestinians being asked to make more concessions. Just that language that we have here in the US about Israel-Palestine, the idea that an occupied people who've had their land stolen from them are expected to concede that land to the people who have occupied them and stolen their land. It's madness. It's not language we would use in any other walk of life or in any other conflict. We don't use it in the context of Crimea, Ukraine, and Russia. But we do use it, and we have used it for years in the Middle East in relation to the occupied territories. What's so interesting about the current moment, of course, is that Donald Trump, there's always a silver lining to Donald Trump's awfulness, and that is that he takes any issue, and he's so extreme on it. He's so extreme, even by American presidential standards, that he forces people off whatever fence they were sitting on. And I think what he's done in the last 24 hours, with the help of his son-in-law, with the help of Netanyahu and MBS of Saudi Arabia, who's also endorsed this plan, is that he's forced people to basically take off the blinkers and recognize this for what it is. The conflict now is no longer Israel versus Palestine, as it's often set up. As Professor Khalidi pointed out, it's not. It's a one-sided war. But it's apartheid. And Americans now have to decide, do they support apartheid or do they not support apartheid? There's no more nonsense about two-state solutions and all of that rubbish. That's gone. That's finished, finally over. No one pretends it's still there on the table. It's, do you support apartheid or do you not support apartheid? That is what we should be asking Democratic presidential candidates, and that is what journalists should be discussing in the media, in their op-eds, in their cable news discussion panels.
And many talk about American opinion polls. They're very interesting on the issue of Israel-Palestine.
So we are often told by supporters of the Israeli occupation in Washington, D.C., especially Republicans, that the reason the United States backs Israel so blindly, gives it billions of dollars, turns a blind eye when it massacres children in Gaza, is because American public opinion is behind Israel, because Americans want to support the, quote, only democracy in the Middle East, as is often sold, which is not actually true. Going back many, many years, if you look at the polling on this subject, most Americans, the majority or a plurality of Americans, say they don't want the United States to take the side of Israel or the Palestinians. They want the United States to be what it claims to be, but of course is not, and that is an honest broker, an impartial outside force, which it's never been, of course. And what's so interesting is I think it was about a year ago, the University of Maryland, Shibli Telhami, who's a great academic and pollster, carried out some polling of Americans on the Middle East, which found that there was almost an even split between Americans on whether they support a two-state solution, as is framed by the establishment. 36%, I think, of Americans versus a one-state solution, a democratic, binational, secular state in which Palestinians and Jews all have, you know, one vote, one person, one vote, equal rights. And that was around 35%. It was almost even. It was a third of Americans were two-state, a third of Americans were one-state. And here's what's so interesting, Amy. When you tell Americans that there is no two-state solution, that option is gone, the vast majority, 2 out of 3 Americans say we support a one-state solution with equal rights for everyone. Because Americans, shock horror, like the idea of one person, one vote. That's what this country is supposed to be built on. And they don't like the idea of saying, you know what, we're going to take a people and put them under occupation and disenfranchise them in perpetuity. And that's what this Kushner plan does. It basically says you're never getting anything else. This is what you get. Israel gets to annex what it's like, takes over whatever part of the West Bank it likes, and the Palestinians, no, they don't get any rights. What's so astonishing about this plan, and you know, Americans, I would argue, the average American would not support this idea, that a Palestinian refugee not only loses their status as a refugee under this plan forever, But Israel gets to veto Palestinian refugees from returning even to a Palestinian state. Israel, not just to Israel, forget the right of return to Israel. Under this plan, if you look at the small print, they can't even return to a Palestinian state without an Israeli veto. So I think this is all a reminder once again that, Edward Said said it best back in 1978. He said, here in the United States and in the West, amongst establishment types, the Palestinian person politically does not exist. They have been completely obliterated. And I think we saw that in the last 24 hours, where you have a White House press conference at which no Palestinians spoke, a White House meeting with the Israeli leadership but not with any members of the Palestinian leadership, and a plan put forward by the White House which had no Palestinian input whatsoever. It's the complete and utter erasure of the Palestinians by the U.S. political establishment, by the U.S. administration.
Right.
Well, Mehdi Hasan, before we move on to the issue of the Senate impeachment trial of President Trump that's taking place at the same time, it seems to have motivated a great deal in President Trump. From January 3rd, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, to his setting precedent last Friday, speaking at a Right to Life march in Washington, D.C., the first sitting president ever to do this, and then suddenly announcing he's releasing a Middle East peace plan. I wanted to turn back to Rashid Khalidi. You had talked about some Gulf states perhaps supporting the president. If you can talk about the significance of Saudi Arabia, perhaps one of the most closest allies with the United States, along with Israel.
Well, I think this brings up something that people don't think about very often. The only reason that Israel is able to maintain its regional superiority is because most Arab states are not democratic. The only countries that could or would buy into this are countries which can suppress their domestic public opinion. So the absolute monarchies of the Gulf, including the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Bahrain, whose ambassadors were at this shameful ceremony yesterday in Washington, are countries, like a few others in the Arab world, Egypt and so forth, ruled in different ways, but in ways that completely exclude representation, democracy, parliaments, public opinion, a free press, and so on and so forth. In those Arab countries where those things do exist, countries like Lebanon or Kuwait or Tunisia, you have popular outrage at what is being done in Washington. The absence of democracy in the Arab world is a precondition for this kind of thing happening. Only regimes which are capable of completely suppressing their public opinion would support such an outrageous derogation of international law, Arab rights, Arab dignity, as unfortunately a few of these governments have, and I'm afraid will. But it's vital to understand these are not the Arabs. These are a group of kleptocrats who control their countries absolutely against the will of their people, and who are able to get away with this partly because they're protected by the United States. So you have had a few Arab governments that have either squeaked their approval or failed to indicate their disapproval or shamefully sent their ambassadors to this sham ceremony. But it is vital to understand what they are and who they are and what they represent. They don't represent anybody except the elites which dominate those countries.
Rashid Khalidi, we want to thank you for being with us. Edward Said, professor of modern Arab studies at Columbia University. His latest book, just out, The 100 Years' War on Palestine. As we continue with Mehdi Hasan of The Intercept, talking about the Senate impeachment trial of President Trump. On Tuesday, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell told fellow Republican senators in a private meeting he doesn't yet have the votes to block Democrats from calling impeachment witnesses. Democrats have pushed for former National Security Advisor John Bolton to testify. On Sunday night, the New York Times published details about a manuscript of Bolton's forthcoming book, where he claims Trump personally told him he wanted to maintain a freeze on $391 million in military aid to Ukraine unless Ukraine turned over materials related to his political rival, Joe Biden. On Tuesday, Trump's defense team wrapped up their opening arguments. Trump's lawyers, including Jay Sekulow, repeatedly tried to dismiss the reports about Bolton as allegations.
The trial of the leader of the free world and the duly elected President of the United States. It is not a game of leaks and unsourced manuscripts. That's politics, unfortunately, and Hamilton put impeachment in the hands of this body, the Senate, precisely and specifically to be above that fray.
The impeachment trial continues today for a phase where senators will have 16 hours to ask questions to the House impeachment managers and the president's legal team, though they can't do it directly. To talk more about impeachment, we're still with Mehdi Hasan in Washington, senior columnist at The Intercept and host of the Deconstructed podcast, also host of Upfront at Al Jazeera English. So it looks like the vote will come on Friday on whether there will be witnesses. You have President Trump's former chief of staff, General John Kelly, not always a fan of John Bolton, essentially calling Trump a liar, saying he believes what John Bolton is saying, that he directly told Bolton that he was withholding the aid to Ukraine to get them to investigate his political rival, Joe Biden. Talk about the significance of what's happened so far.
Yeah, it's very significant in the sense, Amy, that it's yet another reminder that Donald Trump is a liar. As you mentioned, John Kelly calling him a liar. He's lied this morning on Twitter. He's just put out a couple of tweets in which there are multiple lies, claiming that, witnesses are only for the House, not the Senate, which is not true, and other multiple false statements. So it's not only significant in that it's a reminder that the Trump administration and the GOP and the Senate and the House are lying to us about all of this. But it's also a reminder about how this trial is not really a trial because it doesn't involve any witnesses at the moment. There have been 15 impeachment trials in the Senate since the beginning of the United States. That's including judges, not just two presidents, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. In every single one of those 15 impeachment trials, there have been witnesses. At the Bill Clinton impeachment trial, in which Mitch McConnell was involved, there were 3 witnesses, Monica Lewinsky, Sidney Blumenthal, and Vernon Jordan. The idea that you can have a trial without any witnesses, I think, is absurd. I think even the average American, even a Republican, would accept that that premise is absurd, the idea that you have a trial but there are no witnesses. The idea that you have a trial in which the jurors, because that's what the Republican senators are going on the record saying, we're coordinating with the White House, we have no interest in being fair or impartial, as Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham have said. That would not happen in any other trial. So this whole trial has been a farce since day one. You mentioned Jay Sekulow. He's been lying to us since day one, lying about the entire process. Multiple factually inaccurate statements put forward and fact-checked in real time by the Trump legal team. And now you have this John Bolton revelation, which is hugely ironic because we've always known that John Bolton wanted regime change around the world. I just didn't realize he wanted regime change in Washington, D.C. And he's come out with this book that's, is going to come out in a few weeks. The New York Times got hold of an unpublished manuscript in which he basically says, the president told me, hold back military aid until we get these investigations into the Bidens from the Ukrainians. Now, what's so interesting, Amy, is that the Trump legal team's argument has been, we have not heard a single fact witness testify that this happened, which is a kind of chicken and egg situation because you need to let John Bolton testify and then you will have a fact witness who says that this happened. So the whole Republican strategy has been, we can't allow witnesses to come forward and say what happened, but at the same time they're saying, Amy, there are no witnesses who have come forward and said what happened. They want to have their cake and eat it, which is bizarre and dishonest.
Can you talk about the division in the Republican Party, the significance of, we're broadcasting here from Utah, of Utah's junior senator, Mitt Romney, saying he's definitely calling for witnesses. And then you've got Susan Collins, who often makes noises, but then usually sides with the president, Murkowski in Alaska, and particularly Lamar Alexander of Tennessee.
I think you put your finger on it there, Amy, when you said Susan Collins, who usually kind of makes these noises and then sides with the president. That's a pretty accurate description of every quote-unquote moderate Republican in the era of Trump. We've seen this script before where they make all the right noises so the media take them seriously. You saw last week Murkowski and Collins and others coming out and saying, oh, we were hearing out the House managers. And then Adam Schiff said something mean about heads on pikes, and now we're not listening to him anymore. It's childish behavior. It's cynical and self-serving behavior. For me, I would advise everyone at home and all of my journalistic colleagues in this town and elsewhere not to fall for the same trick again. We saw this during the Brett Kavanaugh impeachment hearings, Amy, where people came out and said, Jeff Flake, do you remember Jeff Flake, the great moderate Republican senator? They came out and said, let's have an FBI investigation, which wasn't really an FBI investigation. It was just a fig leaf of an investigation, but it enabled people like Flake to say, look, look, we're open-minded. We're listening to the evidence. We're not just being Trump shills. And I think that's the case with all of these Republican senators. Mitt Romney has a long history of talking a good game and then getting behind Trump when he has to. And I just don't think they are actually going to vote for witnesses. I don't think that Mitch McConnell is going to lose this vote. But you know what? I do think that Democrats should come out and call the Republican bluff. I've been saying this for a while, Amy. Come out and say, yes, you want Joe Biden? Have Joe Biden. You want Hunter Biden? Have Hunter Biden. You want the House managers, Uber drivers? You can get them to testify as well. Have whoever you like, but give us John Bolton, give us Mick Mulvaney, give us people close to the president who were part of the conversations in which the president did all of this stuff that he claims he didn't do.
Mehdi Hasan, we want to thank you for being with us, senior columnist at The Intercept, host of the Deconstructed podcast, also host of Upfront at Al Jazeera English. This is Democracy Now! Of course, we'll continue to cover the Senate impeachment trial. We stream it every day at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Coming back, we go to South Dakota. Stay with us. The border, Nicholas Godin. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. The South Dakota legislature is expected to debate a bill today that would criminalize gender-affirming surgery for transgender youth. If passed, House Bill 1057 would make it a felony for doctors to provide anyone under the age of 16 with puberty blockers, hormones, and other transition-related health care. Medical professionals who do provide this care would face up to 10 years in prison. The Republican-backed bill passed in committee last week. Quincy Park, a transgender youth, testified against the South Dakota bill in the legislature.
Let me be clear. As someone who researched my own treatment options and someone who this bill would directly affect, what you're doing is not preventing harm. You're actively denying medical treatment to children who have such strong feelings of disconnect from their bodies that over half of them are or have been suicidal at some point in their lives.
On Tuesday, South Dakota introduced another anti-trans bill that would authorize parents to deny gender-affirming treatment to their children. It's the third bill targeting trans youth introduced in South Dakota this year alone, and one of more than 25 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced around the country. On Monday, I spoke to Chase Strangio, Deputy Director for Transgender Justice with the ACLU's LGBT and HIV Project, and the award-winning director Yancey Ford, who became the first openly transgender director nominated for an Oscar for his film Strong Island in 2018. I began by asking Chase Strangio to talk about what exactly is happening in South Dakota.
What we're seeing over the course of the last 5 years are escalations in attacks from state lawmakers on LGBTQ people, particularly on trans youth. And this year, South Dakota has a bill that will actually criminalize life-saving care for trans young people. So we're talking about care that the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends, that the American Medical Association recommends. Just last week, a study came out documenting that the provision of this very care reduces suicidality in transgender young people. So now we have lawmakers disregarding science, disregarding the urgent needs of the trans community and saying, we do not care that you might die. We are going to make your health care and indeed your life a crime. So I have to say, having done this work for a long time, this truly is one of the most drastic measures that I've seen moving through a state legislature, and it's at risk of passing.
I mean, if you can also explain both the science of these drugs, but then what this bill says, that they would put a medical provider in jail for up to 10 years for engaging in medical treatment of a patient?
Yeah, so these bills criminalize health care that has been provided to trans young people for decades, including puberty blockers, which are medical interventions that really just put a pause on puberty so young people are able to affirm their gender and ultimately go through puberty consistent with who they are. And these are medications that are used for a range of different conditions. And under the bill, they would be perfectly fine if used for other conditions. Only for transgender young people would they become a crime. And the same is true with the hormone therapy that the legislation would criminalize. And again, the lawmakers supporting the bill are talking about surgery, but the bill criminalizes many non-surgical interventions for trans youth that have been utilized to save lives and ensure that trans young people have comparable health outcomes to their non-transgender peers. And the bill itself is a bill targeting medical professionals, which would not only compromise their licensure, but criminalize the care that they provide, including potentially throwing medical providers in jail for providing care that would save the lives of their patients. And at the committee hearing in the House, the head of the South Dakota Academy of Pediatrics testified that they had 200 years of physician experience in the room and that the legislature was urging them to make a decision between jail and saving the lives of their patients. And even in the face of that testimony, they moved this bill forward.
I want to go to the bill's sponsor. This is South Dakota Republican legislator Fred Deutsch speaking in a video posted on the Family Heritage Alliance Facebook page.
It's a bill to help, like I said, with these children that are suffering. It prevents surgeries. It prevents prescription of puberty blockers to block their normal developmental puberty, as well as gives them strong cross-sex hormones. So if they're a boy, it would prevent strong applications of estrogen, and if you're a girl, the testosterone. Both of them mess children up terribly. We're talking about mutilation, sterilization, and a host of other medical complications, thinning of the bones, brain issues, heart issues. It's just crazy what's going on. We're trying to protect our kids.
So that's South Dakota Republican legislator Fred Deutsch, the sponsor of the bill. Chase Strangio, he says he's saving children's lives. Respond to his arguments.
I mean, I think the first and most important response is that he's actually killing children. And he is a chiropractor who every single year introduces multiple bills targeting the trans community. And every year we fight those bills with the truth of our lives, with science on our side, with business on our side, with whole communities showing that what he is doing is a systematic attack on our community. But I have to say, it is getting so difficult year after year to hear these attacks. We already lost one of our lead trans advocates in South Dakota to suicide who fought against these bills. And now we have lawmakers distorting science in the service of actually through documentation, acting in ways that will kill young trans people. And so I have to say, I used to think it was about fear or confusion, and now I truly think that they are implementing a plan that they actively don't want us to survive, and we are every day going to fight back against that.
Chase Strangio, can you talk about the fact that this bill, the vote on the bill, has been delayed from Monday to, we believe, Wednesday? Is there something significant in this? Are they getting a lot of response from around the country? And also, if you can comment on the South Dakota governor, Governor Kristi Noem, who has said she has, quote, a few concerns about the bill. What do you understand are her hesitations?
So, we don't know exactly why the vote was delayed, but I am going to interpret it as favorable to our side. It gives us more time to push people to continue to contact their lawmakers, and it did come after the governor expressed concerns about the bill. She specifically noted that the bill interferes with the parental rights to dictate the health care for their minor children, which is a longstanding fundamental right. The ACLU has made it clear that we will sue them if they pass this bill, and we are driving support all across the country for the trans community, making sure that every single lawmaker in South Dakota knows that we are watching their vote in the House, and if it moves from the House to the Senate, we will be holding them accountable there as well. So, hopefully this means that they're reconsidering their votes and that we can ultimately stop this thing. But no matter what, whether it passes both chambers, we're going to keep pushing the governor to make sure that she knows that those concerns are legitimate, and she should absolutely veto this bill if it gets to her desk. And if she does sign the bill into law, then we will see her in court.
I want to bring Yancey Ford into this conversation, who is also here in Park City, Utah. Chase, you were just here but went back to New York. Both of you are featured in this new incredible documentary called Disclosure about trans life. But Yancey Ford is the first openly trans director to be nominated for an Oscar. And last week, though you weren't in South Dakota, Yancey, you were tuning in through the stream of South Dakota Public Broadcasting, watching this debate closely. Your response to what you were seeing on the floor of the South Dakota legislature?
I was appalled. I was appalled to listen to a legislator who was claiming, under the auspices of protecting vulnerable children, to have the right to insert himself and his beliefs into life-saving medical treatment that is provided by, professionals, doctors, actual people with actual medical training, science behind them, to provide children in South Dakota with gender-affirming treatment that, children and their parents seek out. It was amazing to me to hear someone actually claim that a quote-unquote natural pause, right? The pause that would allow for puberty to kick in and quote-unquote solve some children's gender dysphoria. It was like tuning into a broadcast from Mars, where the crazy people had taken charge of the legislator and were all of a sudden doctors and psychiatrists and endocrinologists and knew better than the 100 years of collected, medical wisdom alone, not in addition to the parents in the room. It never ceases to amaze me how determined people are to erase trans people, even when they're children. Like, I remember when I was 16, 15, 14, being fully aware of what I was dealing with. And if I had had those choices, if my parents had had those choices when I was that age, I would have had a different childhood. And that someone wants to say, no, you cannot provide love and care and medical treatment and affirmation to your child because I think that transgender is a made-up category of. I was furious. I was furious, and I think that the thing that is the most scary thing about that for me is that it's not just South Dakota. There are, I think, 13 other states that are going to introduce legislation almost identical to the legislation that was introduced by this lunatic.
And I want to get to that, the other legislation. But first, Chase Strangio, in 2016, you wrote a piece on the ACLU's blog titled, "If I Were a Student in South Dakota, Chances Are I Would Not Survive into Adulthood." You talked about suicidality. Can you give us the figures on trans youth taking their own lives?
Yeah, no, it's staggering. And I wrote that piece in 2016 because South Dakota was in the exact same position, considering a bill to bar trans young people from accessing the restroom consistent with who they are. And we're talking about a community that has documented rates of suicidality that are close to 50%. And those documented rates are directly tied to discrimination that people face in every aspect of life. And when you have government officials with the most power in the state telling young people that they either don't exist or that they shouldn't, we know that that exacerbates the rates of suicide. And what we do also know is that when young people are given access to the very medication that is being criminalized by this bill, those suicide rates drop to being comparable to non-transgender peers. And so we have lawmakers equipped with information about how young people can either live or die, and they are choosing quite clearly the path of increasing the likelihood that our communities suffer serious harm, including early death. And, I think about myself as a young person, and I struggled so much. But I didn't have lawmakers telling me that my care should be criminalized. Now we're in a context where that's what lawmakers are saying to the youth who are watching, and we know that they are hurting because of it. And so I am just going to be out here every single day, and I know that my other trans folks are too, to make sure that we tell young people that we are going to fight for them and that we stop these things from becoming law so that people's medication and people's life-saving support is not immediately cut off and criminalized.
So can you talk about the legislation that is being introduced around the country right now, the anti-trans legislation?
Yeah, so the bill in South Dakota is typical of one of two bills that we're seeing this year that have been introduced in over a dozen states. The bills are both the bills targeting young people through the criminalization or other bans on access to health care, including bills that propose intervening through child protective services for parents who support their trans young people. So imagine how important it is to have parental support. We're actually seeing proposals to make that support itself potentially a reason to remove a child from a home. So that is another way that we're talking about incredibly dangerous interventions in the survival of trans young people. And the second type of bill that we're also seeing in about 8 or 9 states are bills that would bar trans athletes from participating in scholastic athletics consistent with who they are. And those bills, like so many bills we've seen in the past, are fundamentally connected to controlling the bodies of all people. For example, some of these bills talk about how if any girl is disputed as a girl, they have to bring in medical documentation of their internal and external reproductive organs, their chromosomes, and their naturally occurring hormone levels. I mean, that is going to be an unbelievable amount of the policing of the bodies of all young women and girls. And so we're talking about legislation that will have a sweeping impact across the country, not just on trans young people, but on any young person who doesn't fit very specific norms of gender. And this is just the beginning of session, so I expect we're going to see a lot more.
And what are the states to look at here, where these bills are being introduced?
So, you know, we're following South Dakota closely. We have bills in Kentucky, in Oklahoma, in Georgia, in Washington, in Tennessee, in Indiana, in New Hampshire. I expect that, you know, we're going to see more. Arizona has a few bills pending. Every state is on a different timeline in terms of how quickly these things will move. I think that whatever happens in South Dakota will ultimately set the tone for the rest of session. So it's critical that we stop that bill there so that we can continue to build momentum to ensure that we're able to protect trans young people from these really egregious attacks all over the country.
Finally, can you talk about the parallels to anti-choice legislation around the country? I mean, it sounds so similar to arguments made against abortion, legislators trying to say that it's the abortion that will endanger a woman's life as opposed to a backstreet alley abortion. Are we seeing parallel legislation in these states?
Absolutely. We are seeing the reality that our gender justice movements are completely tied together and our opponents are operating out of the same playbooks. The very things that have progressed through the anti-choice movement over the years around criminalizing the bodies of people who are pregnant, around restricting access to bodily autonomy, and then criminalizing the medical providers who provide medical care that is well supported by the medical profession is exactly what we're seeing here. And it's in the same states. You know, for example, in Georgia, where they threatened to introduce a criminal ban on health care for trans young people, they passed a criminal ban on a 10-week abortion ban. So they're following the exact same playbook across the country, and they're working together. So I think it's important that we remind ourselves that we have to work together too, because all of these fights are about whether or not we're ultimately going to be able to retain control over our body and our self-determination, and that is going to impact every aspect of our lives. You know, our ability to control our futures in the labor market, our education, our opportunities, our family planning, and these are critical, you know, LGBT issues, gender justice issues, and racial and economic justice issues as well.
Chase Strangio, Deputy Director for Transgender Justice with the ACLU's LGBT and HIV Project. Yancey Ford as well, first openly transgender director nominated for an Oscar Award for his film Strong Island in 2018. And that does it for our show. We'll be live streaming the Senate impeachment trial starting at 1 p.m. Eastern Time today, as we do every day during the impeachment trial. On Thursday, we'll be joined by the actor, the director, the writer, Viggo Mortensen, about his new film called Falling. And Thursday's performance here in Salt Lake City, in Park City, at the Egyptian Theater of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. The late, great historian Howard Zinn died 10 years ago this week. I'll also be speaking 2 o'clock on Friday here in Park City at the Park City Museum right next to Dolly's bookstore. You can check it out at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Nina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Laura Gottesdiener, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Trina and Dorothy Marie Studio. Special thanks to Dennis Moynihan, Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman from Park City, Utah. Thanks so much for joining us.